In the last half of the 19th century, photography was not yet the swift miracle it is today. It was an act of patience, a ritual more akin to conjuring than capturing. A single portrait might demand that a person remain perfectly still for several minutes, eyes fixed, breath shallow, body locked in quiet resistance against the slow machinery of exposure. To move was to vanish. To blink was to blur. Children, of course, were hopeless at stillness. They squirmed, they cried, they blinked at the flash of light, or fidgeted at the weight of unfamiliar clothing. Yet parents, particularly mothers, longed for the fragile likeness of their children to be preserved, for mortality was a constant visitor in the Victorian home. Fevers, infections, and accidents claimed young lives without warning. A photograph was a talisman against disappearance, a proof that a beloved face had once existed. So, in photography studios across London, Liverpool, Edinburgh, even small provincial towns, there emerged a strange, quiet innovation. When a child could not keep still, the mother would remain in the frame, veiled, cloaked, or disguised. She became the stillness itself. Draped in patterned fabric that matched the chair or the backdrop, she would sit behind the child, holding them upright, her hands pressed gently but firmly against their tiny ribs. To the camera's unflinching eye, she became a shadow, a blur, a shape that could almost be mistaken for furniture or curtain. Sometimes only her hand betrayed her presence, pale against the child's sleeve. In other photographs, one could make out the ghostly outline of her head, tilted just slightly, as if listening to a heartbeat. These figures were called hidden mothers. The term sounds whimsical today, almost affectionate, as though it described a childhood game, hide and seek beneath lace or velvet. But in truth, the hidden mother was no game at all. She was a figure of both love and erasure, present yet unseen, holding life steady while being written out of the picture. Her invisibility was deliberate, required by both the technical demands of the camera and the social codes of the age. Victorian photography prized formality, hierarchy, and control. It was a world where men faced the lens directly, stern, deliberate, unflinching, while women and children were arranged as delicate ornaments around them. The hidden mother, in this structure, was the ultimate expression of feminine sacrifice, her love made visible only through absence. In some surviving examples, the concealment is almost comical, a mother under a heavy floral rug, a lump behind the child's chair, an oddly human-shaped curtain at the edge of the frame. In others, it is profoundly disturbing. A black cloak envelopes both mother and child, so that the infant's pale face floats in darkness, luminous against an abyss. These images seem less like portraits and more like seances, as though the mother were already a ghost, clinging to her living child one last time. And in a sense, she was. Many hidden mother portraits were made not for the living, but for the dead. Post-mortem photography was a common practice in the Victorian era, especially for infants and young children. The mother would hold her lifeless child steady as if asleep, her presence once again hidden, as though to conceal not only herself, but also the unbearable truth of death. Yet among these hundreds of images, tender, eerie, and mournful, there exists one that has long troubled historians. An image that does not quite fit among the others. The child in the photograph is not dead, but alive, not calm, but fearful. The hidden mother behind her is not a still silhouette of maternal devotion, but something more desperate, the faint shape of a woman mid-motion, struggling perhaps, or restraining herself from speech. The photograph, dated 1890, bears the mark of an obscure London studio on Holloway Road. It was taken by a man named Elias Penrose, a respectable artisan by all accounts, who never sought fame. And yet his creation, this one photograph, has outlived him by more than a century. Collectors call it the Harrow portrait. Historians call it the Invisible Woman of Holloway. To those who have looked closely, and not all can bear to, it is said that the longer one studies the image, the clearer the mother's face becomes through the cloth. As if the camera, despite every effort to hide her, refused to let her disappear. And so begins her story, not of photography, but of visibility, not of death, but of the slow suffocation of being unseen. A story that begins, like so many Victorian tragedies, with a picture meant to preserve love, and ends with the faint, lingering outline of a woman who was never meant to be remembered at all. Holloway Road in 1890 was a corridor of contradictions, gaslit shop fronts glowing faintly through the London fog, the scent of horse dung mingling with chimney soot, laughter leaking from gin houses while beggars slept in doorways. Among these dim facades stood the modest premises of Elias Penrose, photographic portraiture, identified by a fading painted sign above a bay window. Penrose's studio was neither fashionable nor destitute. It existed in that uncertain middle space where craftsmanship survived by humility. Inside, the air always smelled faintly of collodion and varnish, the chemicals that gave photographs their mirror-like sheen. Glass plates leaned in careful stacks beside mahogany tripods and brass-lensed cameras polished to a dull gleam. Faded draperies hung like theatrical curtains behind a single high-backed chair. It was a small kingdom of shadows, half laboratory, half chapel, where Penrose, a quiet man in his 40s with ink-stained fingers, spent his days capturing the faces of London's restless classes. On a grey morning in late March, a visitor arrived who would alter the course of his otherwise ordinary career. The man introduced himself with unhurried arrogance, Mr. Reginald Harrow, of Harrow and Sons Textiles. His reputation preceded him, at least in whispers. Penrose had heard the name mentioned in trade journals and among local merchants, a man of formidable fortune, often described as refined if severe. Harrow's clothes were immaculate, his manner precise, his every movement rehearsed for the gaze of others. Behind him entered a small girl of about 4, pale and solemn, clutching a rag doll missing one eye. Her curls were the color of honey left too long in sunlight. She did not speak. And behind the child came a woman entirely shrouded in black, a thick mourning veil covering her face, her posture bowed as though beneath invisible weight. Penrose assumed she was a recent widow. Such grief-clad clients were not uncommon. Yet the man's tone was brisk, businesslike, utterly devoid of tenderness. "We wish for a family portrait," Harrow said. "My daughter Emily and her governess. I trust you can manage something tasteful." His gaze swept the studio with mild disdain, as though the humble draperies might soil his reputation by association. Penrose gestured politely toward the chair. "Of course, sir. A seated composition, perhaps? If the child would." But before he could finish, Harrow interrupted. "The child will not sit alone. She must be steadied. The governess will hold her." Penrose hesitated. "If the lady prefers, I can use a posing stand." "No," Harrow said sharply. "She will hold the girl. The picture must show the bond, even if the bond is unseen." The phrase unsettled Penrose, though he could not have said why. He began arranging his camera while Harrow adjusted the folds of the child's dress with meticulous precision, smoothing each wrinkle as if punishing the fabric. The veiled woman knelt beside the chair, her gloved hands trembling. "Stillness," Harrow commanded softly, his voice a thread of steel. Penrose lifted the lens cap, beginning the long exposure. The seconds stretched, slow, suffocating. Emily blinked, then froze. Her small chest rose and fell under the pressure of the woman's hands. Through the veil, a muffled sound escaped, something between a whisper and a sob. Penrose looked up instinctively, but Harrow's eyes warned him back into silence. At last, the exposure ended. The child exhaled a small whimper, like a bird freed too soon from a cage. "Excellent," Harrow declared. "Develop it promptly. I shall return tomorrow for the plate." He turned on his heel, ushering the child toward the door. The veiled woman followed, slower, unsteady. As she passed Penrose, a faint corner of her veil brushed his sleeve, and he caught the scent of lavender soap, and beneath it, something metallic, something like fear. When the door closed, the studio felt emptier than it had ever been. Penrose stood motionless beside his tripod, staring at the chair where the child had sat. The imprint of her small body still dented the cushion, and a single golden hair clung to the dark fabric. He should have moved on, prepared the chemicals, cleaned his lens, carried on with the day's work. Yet a chill had settled in him that would not leave. He lit his lamp and looked once more at the empty backdrop, where faint dust motes swirled in the dim light like restless spirits. It was not merely the odd composition or the client's arrogance that disturbed him. It was the sense, irrational, undeniable, that something terrible had been photographed along with them. That behind the veil, the woman's eyes had not been closed in patience, but wide open in silent appeal. And though the exposure had lasted only 12 seconds, Penrose felt as if he had witnessed an eternity of suffering compressed into that small rectangle of glass. The Harrow residence stood on a quiet street in Belgravia, where every window gleamed like polished restraint and every door concealed a secret. To the outside world, Reginald Harrow embodied the virtues of Victorian propriety, wealth without ostentation, manners without warmth. His factories produced the kind of textiles that lined drawing rooms from Mayfair to Manchester: velvet drapes, damask upholstery, black morning crepe. Few paused to imagine that such fabrics might also be used to smother sound. Behind those immaculate curtains, the Harrow home was not a place of comfort but of control. The air inside was always too still, as if conversation itself had been banished. Servants spoke in whispers, clocks were wound to perfect silence. Even the child, Emily, had learned to play without laughter. Margaret Hale arrived there 3 years before the photograph was taken. She was 27 then, a governess of modest lineage and sincere demeanor. Her letters of reference described her as educated, devout, and temperamentally suited to the instruction of delicate children. She accepted the position eagerly. To serve in a house as grand as Harrow's was, for a woman of her background, an opportunity that bordered on salvation. At first, she mistook Harrow's reserve for dignity. He spoke rarely, but when he did, his voice carried the calm precision of a man accustomed to obedience. He paid her well, provided books for the nursery, and allowed her certain freedoms: walks with Emily in the gardens, quiet hours of reading after lessons. The housekeeper, Mrs. Armitage, once remarked that Mr. Harrow favored the governess, not with affection, but with that kind of particular attention men sometimes offer when they believe themselves to be benevolent gods. Over time, Margaret learned the subtle geography of danger in that house. Harrow's temper never erupted, it descended. His cruelty was not of fists or shouts, but of corrections, insinuations, calculated silences. He could undo a person with nothing more than a raised eyebrow. A misplaced spoon at dinner became a lecture on incompetence. A childish mistake, a broken toy, an ink stain, was met with hours of cold withdrawal. Emily adored her governess. It was Margaret who coaxed laughter from her with stories and paper dolls, who taught her to read words like moon and mother. Harrow seemed to watch these small displays with a kind of distant irritation, as though affection itself were a disorder to be cured. Then came the first dismissal. The maid Alice, who had tended Emily since birth, was sent away abruptly after Margaret found her comforting the child one night. Insubordination, Harrow had said, though no one could name the offense. Others followed: the footman, the cook, even Mrs. Armitage herself. Each departure left the house quieter, emptier, until only Margaret, Emily, and Harrow remained. By the winter of 1889, the household had become a machine of ritual. Harrow dined precisely at 8. Margaret and Emily ate alone in the nursery. When Margaret played the piano, the notes carried faintly through the walls, and she could feel him listening, not with pleasure, but with surveillance. One night, during a storm, Emily crept into her bed, frightened by thunder. Margaret held her close until she slept, whispering verses from Tennyson to calm her. When she looked up, she saw Harrow standing in the doorway, silent, his face unreadable in the flash of lightning. He turned away without a word, but the next morning the piano was locked and her key confiscated. After that, Harrow began to speak of propriety. He spoke of appearances and the sanctity of household order. His manner toward Margaret grew colder, more deliberate. When he addressed her, it was with the politeness of a master instructing a disobedient servant. Yet his eyes told another story, not of disdain, but of ownership. It was during this time that Margaret began wearing the dark veil he had given her for mourning, though no one had died. He insisted upon it during outings, explaining that a governess of modesty should avoid unnecessary notice. The fabric smelled faintly of the same chemicals used to treat his textiles: heavy, synthetic, impossible to breathe through for long. Her world shrank to the nursery and the garden, her conversations limited to the child and the sound of her own heart. She no longer wrote to her relatives. Letters, she discovered, were intercepted. Visitors were discouraged. Even the postman seemed to avert his eyes when he passed the gate. In that suffocating quiet, time thickened. Days blurred together into a single, muted thought. Escape. But escape from what? She had done nothing wrong. She was not imprisoned, not in any way that could be named. She was simply unseen, unheard, unrecorded. It is said that when one lives long enough in silence, one begins to doubt the sound of one's own voice. And Margaret Hale, once so articulate, so precise in her teaching, had begun to forget what her laughter sounded like. The house on Belgrave Street was no longer a home. It was an echo chamber amplifying only one voice, his. And it was within that echo that the idea of the photograph was born. It was Harrow's idea, of course. All his cruelties came disguised as refinement. The photograph, he explained, was to commemorate Emily's 4th birthday. A portrait of legacy, he called it, one that would capture the dignity of the household. His voice carried the calm authority of a man who confuses command with care. Margaret had not left the house in months. She was pale from the absence of sunlight, her body stiff with tension. When Harrow told her of his plan, she felt a flicker of something almost like hope, a chance, however brief, to step beyond those oppressive walls. But even that hope curdled when he added, with chilling precision, "You will be present, of course, though not visible. It will be more fitting." He said it the way one might speak of rearranging furniture. Margaret did not answer. She had learned that silence was the safest language in his house. The morning of the sitting dawned bleak and wet. Harrow was in good spirits, humming tunelessly as the carriage rattled over cobblestones toward Holloway Road. Emily sat between them, clutching her doll, her face expressionless. Margaret wore the black veil Harrow insisted upon, a dense, heavy fabric that dimmed the world to a blur. Beneath it, her breath condensed into small, fevered clouds. When they arrived at the studio, she hesitated on the threshold, overwhelmed by the strange, chemical air, a scent of varnish, dust, and old ghosts. Penrose, the photographer, greeted them politely. His eyes lingered for a moment on Margaret's veiled figure, not in curiosity, but in quiet concern. He had seen widows before, but this woman's stillness seemed less like grief and more like captivity. Harrow took control at once, arranging the scene with an almost theatrical obsession. He positioned the child, adjusted the drapery, and then turned to Margaret. "You will sit here, just behind her. Hold her upright. Do not move." He produced from his coat a swath of black cloth, finer than the mourning veil, but thicker, heavier. It was, Penrose realized, one of Harrow's own fabrics. To prevent distraction, Harrow explained smoothly. The camera should see only the child. He draped it over Margaret's shoulders, then over her head, until she vanished entirely. Beneath the fabric, the air was dense and warm. She could smell the dye, sharp and synthetic. The world receded into darkness, save for a thin glimmer of light at the hem, where her fingers clutched Emily's waist. Penrose adjusted his lens. He felt uneasy. Something in the child's posture, rigid, forced, troubled him. "If you wish," he suggested gently, "we could use a posing brace instead. The lady needn't." "No," Harrow cut in. "The mother," he paused, correcting himself. "The governess will hold her. There is meaning in that." Penrose hesitated, but he was not a man to question clients of means. He nodded and prepared the plate. The studio fell silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. When the exposure began, 12 long seconds unfolded like a lifetime. Inside the dark cocoon of fabric, Margaret's heartbeat thundered in her ears. Emily trembled against her, small hands twitching. Margaret whispered, too softly for anyone to hear, "Still now, my darling. It will soon be over." But she herself was not still. She was suffocating. The weight of the cloth pressed down upon her shoulders like morning itself made solid. She could feel Harrow's gaze through the darkness, not the tender observation of a father, but the cold scrutiny of ownership. 9 seconds. 10. 11. In that eternal second before the end, something in Margaret rebelled, not in movement, but in spirit. She lifted her head beneath the shroud, the fabric pressing against her lips, her breath forcing the faint outline of a face into its surface. Her eyes opened wide, staring blindly toward the lens she could not see. Then Penrose replaced the lens cap. The silence that followed was thicker than before. Emily whimpered, and Margaret instinctively moved to comfort her, but Harrow's voice cut through the air. "Do not touch her. The moment is complete." He handed Penrose his card and instructed him to have the plate ready the following day. Then, with a curt nod, he led the child from the studio. Margaret followed last, moving like someone newly hollowed. As the door closed, Penrose realized he had not seen the woman's face, not once. He had captured her presence, yet never glimpsed her existence. He looked again at the empty chair, at the drapery still shifting faintly where she had sat. It was as if the air itself remembered her shape. And though he could not name the feeling, he sensed that what had occurred in his studio was not the making of a portrait, but the burial of a person, an act of concealment masquerading as art. Later, when the chemicals hissed and the image began to bloom on the glass plate, Penrose would see her again, faint, blurred, almost invisible, but there. A woman trapped inside a shadow. A breath caught forever beneath a veil. That night, Elias Penrose did not go home. The studio, usually locked by twilight, remained lit long past midnight. Outside, the fog thickened over Holloway Road until even the lamplight seemed hesitant to enter. Inside, Penrose stood alone among his bottles of developer and trays of silver nitrate, staring at the still wet glass plate on his workbench. He had processed thousands of portraits in his career, families, widows, soldiers, merchants, yet never had he felt what he felt now, a trembling unease that bordered on reverence. The exposure had been technically perfect. The child's features were sharp, her dress luminous in contrast to the shadowed backdrop. And yet, behind her, barely discernible at first glance, something stirred. He leaned closer, holding the plate up to the light. There, pressed against the darkness like a fingerprint upon eternity, was the faint outline of a face. A woman's face, blurred, but unmistakably human. It seemed to emerge from the very fabric that was meant to conceal it, the eyes wide and full of an expression that made Penrose's throat tighten. Not anger. Not sorrow. Something more desperate. He told himself it must be a trick of the chemicals, an error in the exposure, a phantom of process. But as he watched, he thought he could almost see movement, a shifting of shadow within shadow, as though the figure behind the veil were breathing. He stepped back. The lamp flame flickered. A draft passed through the room though no window was open. Penrose had always prided himself on discipline, on precision. Photography, to him, was a craft of science, the obedience of light to chemical law. But now, holding that image, he felt the boundaries between science and spirit begin to blur. The studio air seemed charged, aware. He poured fresh chemicals, prepared a duplicate print, his hands shaking slightly. As the image developed a second time in the tray, the face became clearer still, the curve of cheekbone, the faint imprint of lips pressed against cloth. There was no denying it now, the woman had not been still. She had moved, if only slightly, during the exposure, and in that movement she had spoken. Not in words, but in presence. Penrose found himself whispering, "What were you trying to say?" The room gave no answer, only the faint hiss of evaporation from his trays. He recorded his unease in the studio ledger that night. Beneath the entry Harrow, 1890, he wrote in small, cramped script. An unusual plate. The child is rigid, the mother veiled but visible. Her expression defies description. I cannot decide whether it was sorrow or warning. Something in the man's manner, controlling. The woman seemed fearful. This image unsettles me. He paused, then added a single line more. Perhaps I have photographed despair itself. When dawn arrived, Penrose extinguished the lamps and sat in silence. He had resolved to deliver only one print to Harrow, the formal one, properly varnished and mounted. The other he would keep. Not out of greed, but instinct. It felt wrong to let the man possess the image entirely. The following morning, Harrow returned alone. His voice was curt, his manner unchanged. He examined the portrait with brisk satisfaction, paying without comment. "A fine likeness," he said, "though the child appears solemn." "She was tired," Penrose replied. "The sitting was long." Harrow smiled faintly. "Children must learn composure. It serves them well in later life." When he left, the bell over the door jingled once, then silence swallowed the room. Penrose locked the door and took the second plate, the unvarnished one, and wrapped it in cloth. Beneath the floorboards of his workbench, where he kept old negatives and unpaid receipts, he placed the hidden print. He could not explain why. Only that he could not bear to destroy it, nor to let it see daylight again. In the weeks that followed, Penrose dreamed often of the veiled woman. In his dreams she did not speak, but her face emerged and receded, as if trapped behind glass. Sometimes he woke certain he had heard a faint knocking from beneath the floorboards, rhythmic, insistent, almost like a heartbeat. He began avoiding portrait work altogether, claiming poor health. Neighbors later said his hands trembled, that he stared too long into empty corners as though studying invisible shapes. The chemical smell of his studio grew stronger, acrid, metallic. When he finally closed the shop 2 years later, he left most of his equipment behind. But the floorboards, those he sealed carefully, nailing them down in perfect, measured symmetry. No one ever found his ledger during his lifetime. Yet decades later, when the building was demolished, the workers discovered the hidden case beneath those same boards. Inside were the preserved glass plates, wrapped in aging velvet. On one of them, labeled Harrow 1890, the woman's face was still there, faint but undeniable, as if the chemicals themselves had refused to forget her. And those who looked upon it closely said that if you stared long enough, the eyes behind the veil seemed to stare back. The Harrow estate had always been more mausoleum than home. Its corridors, long and narrow, carried sound like a confession. Every footstep, every whisper, every sigh of wind seemed to echo with something unspoken. The servants said the house remembered. They meant it as superstition, but Edward Harrow believed it too, though he would never have admitted it aloud. After Margaret's death, the house grew quieter still. She had wasted away over the course of a year, consumed, the doctor said, by female melancholia. Harrow had buried her in the family plot, arranged the gravestone, and returned to his study that same evening, pouring himself a drink as though nothing had shifted. Yet something had. The stillness that followed her passing was not peace. It was vacancy, a silence that watched. Emily, once bright and curious, began to speak less. She spent long hours in her nursery, murmuring to herself or to the faded doll her mother had sewn for her. The governess complained of sleepless nights, of the child whispering to corners. Harrow dismissed it all as female fancy. But when the governess resigned suddenly, pale and trembling, she left behind a single remark that unsettled even him. "Sir, the child says her mother comes at night to sit by the window. I cannot stay where such things walk." He replaced her within a week. But from that point on, something inside the house began to shift. It started with the portrait. The photograph from Holloway Road, the one Harrow had once displayed proudly in his study, began to trouble him. He had always regarded it as a symbol of order. His daughter posed in stillness, her mother properly veiled, as decorum required. But now, whenever he looked at it, he saw what he could not explain. At first it was a trick of the light, a shadow where there should be none, a faint suggestion of a face beneath the cloth. Then, as weeks passed, the illusion grew stronger. The woman's outline became more distinct. A pale oval where no light should reach. Eyes, or the memory of eyes, staring out. Harrow told himself it was absurd. He was a man of logic, a merchant of reason. But logic could not account for the subtle shifting of the photograph when no one touched it, nor for the way Emily flinched whenever she passed it. One evening, when he found her standing before the portrait whispering, "She's not gone, father, she's only hiding," he struck her. That night, the glass in the frame cracked clean across the center. He ordered the photograph removed to the attic, but the damage was done. The image had rooted itself in his mind. Wherever he went, at his desk, in the drawing room, even in church, he saw her. Not Margaret as she had been, but the veiled shape from the photograph. Faceless, breathless, patient. Sleep deserted him. The servants began to find him awake at impossible hours, pacing the halls with a lamp, muttering about unfinished exposure and a flaw in the negative. It was in late autumn, during a storm that tore the ivy from the eastern wall, that the final unraveling began. Harrow, half mad from drink and exhaustion, climbed to the attic where the photograph lay hidden. He tore away the dust sheet and stared at it by candlelight. The image was unchanged, yet it seemed alive. The child's figure faintly luminous, the veiled woman behind her unmistakable now, the curve of her face pressed against the shroud like a moth trapped behind glass. "Show yourself," he whispered, gripping the frame. "If you demand to be seen, then be seen." A gust of wind swept through the attic, extinguishing the candle. The window shutters banged open, rain slicing the dark. In the next flash of lightning, Harrow thought he saw her, not in the photograph, but in the reflection of the glass. The veil stirring, the faint glimmer of eyes. When the servants found him the next morning, the attic was in ruin. The photograph lay shattered on the floor, its glass driven deep into the boards. Harrow himself was slumped beside it, breathing but insensible, muttering a single phrase over and over. She was never hidden, she was waiting. He lingered for several months afterward, confined to his bed, haunted by fevered visions. Emily was sent to relatives in Surrey. The house, neglected and half-empty, began to rot from within, wallpaper peeling, mirrors tarnishing, the air heavy with mildew and memory. When Harrow finally died, the death certificate named heart failure. But those who saw his body swore his eyes were open, wide and terrified, as if seeing through the veil at last. And in the ruins of his study, amid the dust and decay, one object remained untouched by time. A small silver frame, empty of photograph, the glass clean and cold as though something, or someone, had finally stepped out of it. The carriage reached the old Harrow estate at dusk, just as the last light was fading into the winter fog. Emily had not seen the house in 15 years. Time had hollowed it as it had hollowed her memories, though even from a distance she recognized its silhouette, the long, narrow windows, the slate roof heavy with moss, the crooked chimneys that leaned like old sentinels against the sky. She had imagined this return 100 times during her years in Surrey, first as a child's nightmare, later as an adult's uneasy curiosity. But now, standing before the gate, she felt neither fear nor nostalgia, only a strange inevitability. As if every road she had taken, every year she had survived, had led back here. The caretaker, a stooped old man she did not know, met her with a lantern. "Miss Harrow," he said softly, his voice thick with the damp air. "We weren't sure you'd come. The house isn't what it was." "Neither am I," she replied. Inside, the air smelled of dust and wet plaster. The furniture was shrouded in linen, the mirrors veiled in black gauze, the trappings of mourning that had never been lifted. As she moved from room to room, her footsteps echoed like whispers. The house felt less abandoned than asleep, waiting for something to wake it. In her father's study, the dust lay thick upon the desk, yet the indentation of his hands remained visible in the leather. She traced them with her fingers, remembering his voice, the clipped, commanding tone that could turn any room cold. From a locked drawer she drew out the only object she had come to find, the silver frame. The glass had been replaced long ago, but no photograph remained inside. The emptiness was more disturbing than any image could have been. It seemed to vibrate faintly in her hand, like a mirror waiting for reflection. That night she slept in her childhood room. Or rather, she tried to. The wind crept through the cracks, and somewhere in the upper corridor, a door opened and shut by itself. Once, half dreaming, she thought she heard the faint creak of the nursery rocking chair, the one her mother had loved, moving in slow rhythm. She rose, lit a candle, and wandered through the darkened hall. The flame trembled, throwing long shadows along the walls. Each familiar object appeared unfamiliar now. The portraits of ancestors staring with painted indifference, the wallpaper faded to the color of old bones. In the nursery, time had stopped altogether. The doll still sat in her tiny chair, its porcelain face cracked, one glass eye missing. Emily felt a pulse of nausea, not from fear, but from recognition. The room smelled faintly of lavender and dust, the same scent her mother had worn. On the small dresser lay a box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside, she found letters, yellowed and brittle. Her mother's handwriting flowed in soft, slanted lines. The letters were never sent, they were addressed to EP, a name Emily did not recognize at first, until, in the half-light it came to her, Elias Penrose, the photographer. The first letter was dated only a week before her mother's death. Mr. Penrose, you do not know me beyond that dreadful sitting. But I have seen what the photograph captured, and I beg you, destroy it. There are things a camera should not preserve. If you value your soul, you will not keep it. My husband has begun to see through the cloth. I fear what he might do. Emily read the words twice, her pulse quickening. Then she noticed, beneath the stack of letters, something heavier, a wrapped parcel bound in fading twine. Her hands shook as she untied it. Inside was a glass plate, cracked but intact. She held it up to the candlelight, and there, faint, ghostly, yet unmistakable, was her mother's image. The veil was thinner than she had imagined. Beneath it, the features were visible now, as if time had developed the photograph further. Margaret Harrow's eyes looked directly into hers. Emily staggered back, nearly dropping the plate. The candle guttered, throwing the image into darkness. But even after the flame was gone, she could still see her mother's face, not on the glass, but in her mind, vivid and alive. A wind rose through the corridor then, rattling the shutters. From somewhere deep in the house came the sound of a door opening, slow and deliberate. Emily whispered, "Mother?" No answer came, only the faint rustle of fabric, like a veil brushing against wood. And though she would tell herself later that it was merely wind, merely memory, she could not shake the sense that the photograph had awakened something. Not just in the house, but in her. Because for the first time since childhood, she understood the truth of that terrible image. Her mother had not been hidden. She had been trapped. And now, after all these years, the veil was thinning once more. At first light, Emily left the house. The storm had passed, leaving the air damp and metallic, the trees around the estate dripping like exhausted sentinels. She carried only a carpetbag, her mother's letters, and the cracked glass plate wrapped in linen. The carriage that took her toward London rattled through the fog like something half-remembered, half-dreamed. The city had changed since she last saw it. The streets were louder, the air thicker with soot and commerce. But beneath the noise, the same pulse ran through it, that restless hum of industry, where the living and the forgotten walked side by side. Emily stepped down near Holloway Road and looked around. The old photography studio, she thought, must be long gone by now. And yet, when she asked after Elias Penrose, an old bookseller across the street nodded slowly, as though the name had never left his mind. "The photographer?" he said. "Yes. Strange man, that one. Vanished near the end of the century. But his shop still stands, 2 doors down. Nobody's kept it since. Folks say the light in that place doesn't behave proper." Emily found the building easily enough. A narrow brick structure with boarded windows and a faded sign that still bore the outline of his name. The door creaked open with little resistance. The air inside was dry, still, and thick with the smell of age, paper, dust, and the faint sweetness of old chemicals. She lit a small lantern and stepped inside. Shelves of glass plates leaned like brittle books against the walls, their labels eaten away by time. In the back room stood a rusted sink, a table scarred with burns, and, above it, a mirror clouded by corrosion. On the wall hung a single photograph, preserved beneath grime. A portrait of a young woman with solemn eyes, her hands clasped around nothing. Emily brushed away the dust. For an instant she thought it might be her mother. But it was someone else, another sitter, another shadow of the past. Then she saw it, a trapdoor in the floorboards, sealed with rusted nails. Her heart beat faster. She took a small knife from her bag and pried them loose, one by one. Beneath, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with cord, lay a box. Inside were glass negatives, dozens of them, stacked carefully like sacred relics. Each was marked in the same small hand: Harrow, Holloway, Finchley, Waltham. Most contained ordinary portraits, women, children, families. Yet in each, there was the same peculiar detail. Somewhere in the background, a blur. A faint suggestion of another presence. Sometimes a hand. Sometimes a shadow that didn't belong. Sometimes, terribly, a face where none should have been. And in the very back of the box, wrapped separately, she found a second plate labeled Harrow 2. Her breath caught. This was not the photograph she had known. The first image had shown her mother veiled, faceless, half consumed by darkness. But this second exposure, this was something else. The same composition, yet subtly altered. Her mother's face was clear now, the veil translucent, her expression unmistakable, calm, resolute, watching. And the child, herself, blurred, as if in motion, turning toward the hidden figure as though to answer a call. It was impossible. Two versions of the same moment. Two truths of the same instant. She turned the plate over, searching for an explanation, and found a note etched faintly along the edge in Penrose's trembling script. The second exposure reveals what the first concealed. I did not make it. She did. Emily stood frozen. The lantern flame wavered. For a moment, the mirror above the workbench seemed to brighten, not from her lantern, but from within itself. She turned, and in its tarnished surface she thought she saw another reflection, her mother's face, patient and waiting, as though the image in the glass had been looking out for years, watching for the one who would return. Then the flame sputtered and died. The darkness that followed was not empty. It had texture, weight, as if filled with unseen breath. She could smell the faintest trace of lavender, her mother's scent. And in the dark, she heard a whisper, soft and almost tender. "You see me now." Emily fled the studio, the broken glass plate clutched against her chest. But even as she stumbled into the daylight, the voice seemed to follow, not from behind, but from within, echoing in her thoughts like something long buried breaking free. She did not yet understand what the second exposure meant, nor why Penrose had hidden it. But she knew one thing with terrible certainty. The photograph had never belonged to her father. It had belonged to her mother. And her mother had not been content to remain unseen.